Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. This week we have another special guest here with Shawn Howard, presidential candidate. So welcome, Shawn. I'm going to give you a chance here to tell us a little bit more about yourself, but if you want to go ahead and just talk about why you're running for president, why you're doing what you're doing, and what you're passionate about.
Sure. Thanks, Josh, for having me on. I appreciate it. I decided I wanted to run probably, well, I filed about a year and a half ago, but after the 2016 election where we had Trump and Hillary Clinton as your candidates, I kept thinking for the general election, the voters really need more choices and more independence and more free thought as opposed to two main parties and then two basically small parties that are typically fringe, libertarian and Green Party, where uh, the platform isn't always free to think of however you want. And what I've seen lately is the Democrats and Republicans just dividing the country up
Mm.
worse and worse by the day. So usually they come out with two terrible candidates, and that's pretty much what happened this time around, same as last time. But the divisiveness and the deviation from the middle and the moderate voices of the world or of the United
Mm.
States has just been the middle's just been abandoned. So I
Mm.
think most people, even though if it's a vocal minority, are in the middle and they just want reasonable and fair solutions to the problems that are in front of us. But what
Mm.
happens is you have these extreme factions on the hard right and the hard left that are much more vocal about what it is that they want, and that tends to push the politicians in those directions. And we've seen the moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats just kind of disappear, where it's taking over the Tea Party hard right, or your Trump Republicans, and
Mm.
then your progressive, if you want to call it that, socialist style people on the left.
Yeah.
So part of the reason I was running was to bring a more moderate voice to the campaign, to the picture, and try to get these people to work a little bit closer
Mm.
together, to try to work out the differences. Because I think you see a lot of people when they first get to Washington, and you can, if you listen to all the freshmen that came to Washington this last cycle, they're very idealistic. They want to work with the other side, and then they get there, and they're taking separate buses, and nobody talks to the other
Mm.
side, and it's just my team versus your team, and nothing really gets done. So
Mm.
I wanted to bring light to that and run and bring a more reasonable voice to the whole process.
Yeah, we hear the term silent majority, and I guess now that I'm thinking about it and hearing what you're saying, you could say the center ground or the reasonable moderates in some ways are the silent majority of this election campaign. Because you've got real extremes that are super loud, and then not so much from the middle ground. But do you think that would be fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. That's pretty much where I think a lot of people are.
And do you think that you offer then something different to what the conventional two candidates offer in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, my conservative friends think I'm too liberal, and my liberal friends think I'm too conservative. I'm a little bit libertarian, but I'm not libertarian because there's certain
Yeah.
things that I don't agree with on that party. So I think it's a good mix of everything, where I want small government and individual responsibility, but at the same time, I recognize that
Mm-hmm.
we could use some level of climate legislation or change. Rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. Don't ignore science. Have a little
Mm-hmm.
bit better response to coronavirus as opposed to ignoring it effectively on the Trump side. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a little bit of both, and I think most people want some more reasonable solutions that's out there. Most people believe in the Second Amendment, but a lot of people want at least some limitations on the types of weapons that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
People believe in the freedom of speech, but it's not unlimited. There's certain areas where you can't go and you can't talk about. So just things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and not going to where your solution is tax increases for all problems, or
Yeah.
um, even if there's X, Y, and Z program that you want to accomplish, it doesn't mean you need to grow the size of the government and tax your citizenry
Mm-hmm.
to get there. There's other ways to do it.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit just about your background and who you are. So, what's your professional background? What did you do for a living? What sort of made you who you are today?
Sure. I'm an investment person by background. I've worked in private client groups for most of my career, worked my way up to chief investment officer a few years back. I was up in Massachusetts for the majority of my career. And then I came down here to Florida about 2.5 years ago. But basically, I've been in wealth management, private client, investment style for my whole career.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, I've been running like political blogs and political things since I was about 30 years old. So for the
Okay.
last 16, 17 years, I've had this kind of fascination with the politics side of things,
Mm-hmm.
just sort of on the outside looking in as opposed to working within the political industry.
Mm-hmm. And do you think your background in the kind of financial world, investment world, um, brings something to the table when it comes to the presidency?
Yeah, I think being fiscally conservative and knowing how to run a business or a group or things like that brings a lot more. It's a little more on the Republican side of things, the conservative
Mm-hmm.
side of things, but balancing a budget is important because you need the long-term strength of the economy, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's in the United States or anywhere. You can't just run debt and deficits for the rest of time. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to have some sort of responsibility to balance those out. And you can see it at the state level. Most states have balanced budget uh, rules that they have to live by,
Mm-hmm.
but the federal government obviously does not. So we're up to, I think, 27 trillion in
Yeah.
debt, annual
Unbelievable.
deficit on top of that. Yeah, and at some point it'll come back to bite us. I mean, it won't right now because the U.S. is a very strong country and the currency is strong.
Mm-hmm.
People still run to U.S. Treasuries and they run to the dollar if there's a global crisis. So that
Mm-hmm.
helps the U.S. get away with it, if you will. With, for example, the U.S. Treasury, the 10-year Treasury is 0.6%. So the cost to finance that debt is extremely low. So the amount of interest that they're paying on the debt is not, it's not completely overwhelming just yet. But if interest rates go back up to where they used to be even 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
then the U.S. is going to have a lot of trouble paying debt load. So it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a larger and larger piece of their overall budget, and it just becomes a domino effect if the rates keep going up, or if
Mm-hmm.
they just
So
keep spending money and adding to the pile.
yeah. So a balanced budget then. So that's a big part of your platform then. So what is it, a kind of moral question, or is it more just a complete economic issue? You know, this thing of a balanced budget. Is that, do you think that's because it's moral to keep a balanced budget, or is it mainly just uh,
No, it's economical. I mean,
pragmatically? Yeah.
government should have the ability to run a deficit if, say, you get into a situation like this where we have a global pandemic and you need to
Mm-hmm.
spend money to keep us afloat in a government mandated recession. So you
Yeah.
need to have the flexibility to be able to go into deficit spending. But it would help if you were at a balanced budget point to start when you got
Mm-hmm.
to, say, 2020 and you ran into this pandemic and you needed to spend some money to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Getting to a balanced budget is more of a goal, end goal than anything else. I mean,
Right.
my platform is more tax neutral and work your way towards a balanced budget, but
Okay.
I don't have any disillusions that it would happen in a year or two.
Yeah,
You've
I can't
got
just do it overnight.
right because you can't cut spending dramatically either, because then you're talking layoffs and departments that get
Mm-hmm.
completely wiped out. I mean, you can have attrition. The way you work, the way you do it in a company is you can just wait for people to leave and then just don't rehire them, or you can have
Mm-hmm.
hiring freeze where you're not hiring any new people, or you have wage freezes and things like that. So you try to get some control over your budget over the course of multiple years, 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. And eventually you would get to a balanced budget. And then from there, you have a lot more flexibility where you can start removing
Mm-hmm.
different departments and things like that if you needed to.
And what do you think are the biggest culprits in terms of the bloat and the overspend that's contributing towards the deficit?
Well, I mean, 2/3 of the budget is entitlement programs, so it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social
Okay.
Security. You could fix Social Security pretty quickly if you just wanted to cut the benefits down for people, say, under 50 years old. I wrote about it on my site as one of the issues, and then just raise the retirement age by about 4 years. So you would not completely short of Social Security, but you'd go a long way if you just raise the retirement age by 4 years, cut the benefits for people that are on the younger side that aren't quite there
Mm-hmm.
yet, and then you'd have a lot more control over the Social Security budget.
Mm-hmm.
However, that's politically not very feasible, so you'll never
Nope.
hear Democrats or Republicans say that because it's third rail on it.
Absolutely. Yep. Suicide
Um,
to talk about that.
yes, yeah, Medicare, Medicaid's a little trickier, but there's no efficiency in it. So, for example, uh, there's talk in Congress for prescription drug costs, and the
Mm-hmm.
government is the largest purchaser of prescription drugs, and because of Medicare and Medicaid, but
Yeah.
they don't negotiate the prices, which is just kind of lunacy.
Yeah.
Actually, Democrats and Republicans kind of agree, at least in theory, on that. It's they deviate on how to enforce it and what happens after the renegotiation. But I would support negotiating prices for the prescription drug prices the government pays to all these pharmaceutical companies, and I think that would help to some extent try to cut the expenses down.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to run it like a business and actually look at the expenses that are accruing
Mm-hmm.
and try to work it down from there, as opposed to just letting it run amok and not
Mm-hmm.
worry too much about who's getting what and how much everything costs.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of I don't know if you're familiar then with the kind of Margaret Thatcher ideology of running a government like it's a housewife running a household. That would be more obviously relevant those days. That was I guess
Mm-hmm.
the late 70s, early 80s. That would have been more common for the wife that was at home to balance the house budget and budget for groceries and this. But this was a big part of her I guess you could say ideology of Thatcherism was that you run the government like you would run your house. You can't go into debt in your house, so why would you do it if you were running the government as well? And
Right, and I think that's a pretty reasonable um, structure, a reasonable
mm-hmm.
strategy. I mean, like I said, you need a little flexibility from time to time as a government to get yourself out of certain situations, but yeah, you need to at least go to the goal
Mm.
of getting a balanced budget and working your way into that direction. But unfortunately, neither party really does that.
Yeah. What?
I've joked that Republicans are only care about the fiscal budget when Democrats are in office, because every time when Bush was in office for 8 years, the budget went up every single year, and there wasn't really a lot of talk about
Mm-hmm.
fiscal responsibility. But then suddenly, for the Obama years, suddenly it was how big is the deficit, how big is the debt, and then
Mm-hmm.
last 3.5 years they've been really quiet about it.
Yeah. Well,
So
what are the reasons, or what are some of the um I guess what's putting off Republicans and Democrats from looking at this as a big issue? How does it benefit them to kind of ignore the deficit and let the national debt just kind of grow and grow?
I think because it's not an immediate, imminent problem. So if it doesn't affect your political race, or if it's not something that's going to blow up within the next
Mm-hmm.
few months, then they're just going to ignore it until it's a major problem. And that goes
Yeah.
for entitlement programs too. They're not going to fix Social Security until they have to.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's just the general strategy of all the
Yeah.
politicians in is don't even touch it unless it's an imminent problem. So when you look at debt and deficit, because the U.S. is such a strong country, they can run this way for a number of years before it really comes back to bite them. Like I said, with interest rates where they are, they can get away with it for a lot longer, unless there's rates go up or unless there's inflation. So if it's
Mm-hmm.
not a major issue, they just say, okay, let's just keep spending.
Yeah. So what do you think it would take to kind of tip this over the edge? So do you think there's like a day of reckoning that's coming anytime soon, or what do you think the circumstances would need to be in order for that to all come crashing down?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's mostly the interest coverage that you're paying on the debt. So I think last time I looked at it, it was about 7-8% of the budget was going to interest rate coverage.
Wow.
So which is a big number, but
Yeah.
it's manageable. If you got that in the 20-25% range, that would be a major issue where the deficits just kind of exponentially go higher because you
Mm-hmm.
have less money to spend on everything else. You could also have inflation, which we've been lucky in the last 10, 20 years to not have any rampant inflation the way we saw it in the late 70s, early 80s. And that could be a major issue for the debt and deficit. But that, those are the major reasons what would come to roost. But until then, I mean, unless they're going to keep spending another, 5 trillion a year on
Mm-hmm.
top of it, and the deficit goes from 27 to 35 and 40. So eventually, it'll be a problem, but I don't think it
Mm-hmm.
isn't right at the moment.
So is there's small steps that we can do then to start to walk this back that would definitely go a long ways towards you know taking us out of this danger zone. Then I guess you would say.
Right. I mean, we're still in sort of a government mandated recession. I mean, theoretically,
Yeah.
we're at the tail end of it. So the government probably needs to spend a little bit more just to
Mm-hmm.
get us back to normalcy, at least carry us through the rest of the year, because the small businesses are just getting crushed right now. If you look at Wall Street and all the stocks, you wouldn't notice it because the big
Mm-hmm.
companies do very well, but the restaurants, small businesses, they're just getting gyms and things like that. They're just getting completely beat up.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you come through with another PPP loan or you let the restaurants and bars and gyms open up fully, which doesn't look like they're going to do in most parts of the country, um, then you've got to provide something in the short term,
Mm-hmm.
at least to get this through. That's only we're talking hopefully 4 6 months, and then the economy's in better shape. I mean, New York started opening their restaurants for indoor seating, but that's only 25% capacity. So all
Mm-hmm.
those small business owners that are in New York City, they're all hurting. You would imagine they are by not being allowed to open up fully, and with the weather getting colder, all that outdoor seating that they've been able to cover themselves a little bit,
Yeah.
that's going to go away with the next few weeks as the
So let's talk a little bit about coronavirus response then. So you mentioned about the um, government mandated recession and this lockdown. What are your opinions on the handling so far, and what perhaps would you change if it was up to you?
Well, the handling has been awful, really. I mean, from pretty much all levels of government. And I'm in Florida, and it's been pretty terrible here, and it's been terrible nationally. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, they've all handled it, I think, relatively poorly. You needed to have testing and contact tracing from the start, and it's not rocket science. It's been done for pandemics in the past, and you've noticed with Asian countries, like South Korea, for example, they are much
Mm-hmm.
faster to this. They started contact tracing. They had pop-up testing facilities right away, and they got control of the virus much
Mm-hmm.
faster than in the United States. Uh, so, for example, in Florida, where we've had 3,000 uh, 3,000 a day, I think, new cases. Now,
Mm-hmm.
South Korea is about 2.5 times the size of Florida, and they're at about 300 or 400 cases a day.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
they clearly have a much better handle on it. And our government officials are basically saying, let's test less, because if we test less, then it won't make us look as bad, because then the numbers will go down. So in
Yeah.
Florida, we were at 10, 11, 12,000 cases a day, and in I think July, and suddenly it started dropping, and now it's down to 3,000. But the number of tests has gone down almost as fast as the number of cases. So they
Mm.
were testing, I think, 75,000 a day, and now it's 20,000 a day.
Okay, so I wasn't aware that the number of tests was actually going down. I thought that was perhaps the president trying to make a point and saying that, well, other countries are reducing the number of tests, that's why they get less cases, so maybe we can do that. But I didn't actually know that this was something that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the just the number of testing that Tampa Tribune does a really good job in showing you the positivity rate, number
Mm-hmm.
of cases, at least in this state, but there's other states that does similar types of numbers, um, and how many cases, how many deaths, how many hospitalizations. So if you track it, I mean, it is technically going down. It's just not going down as fast as they would have you believe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still a problem here. It's a problem throughout the country for the most part. And it's just that they've never, I mean, we're 7 to 8 months into this, and they still don't have contact tracers. They still don't have testing availability for anybody who
Mm-hmm.
wants it, unless you're really important. So if you look at, I'm a big sports fan. So if you
Yeah.
look at the NFL or baseball, they're tested like every single day. Um, and if you go to a hospital around here, it's really hard to get a test. I mean,
Right.
not hard, but but you really have to work at it to
Yeah.
get tested. And it's usually, 3, 4 day turnaround um,
Mm-hmm.
before you can get it. So certain people can get it, no problem, if you're important enough. But they need to make
Yeah.
that readily available for the masses, for everybody. And then once you get a better handle, excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
better handle on who's positive, and you contact trace all the people that have been in contact with them, and then you can quarantine them in theory, then
Right.
you'll have a better handle on this.
Okay, so say the number of tests then, say you were doing this contact tracing and things were starting to seemingly get out of control, and things, the number of cases was rising, number of deaths were rising. What then in your mind would be a practical solution to starting to stop this rise in cases if this was to happen? Say it was to spiral, kind of, increasing numbers. What are reasonable steps to take to try and slow that down?
Well, some of the other steps they've taken are reasonable in that, events, games, sporting events, concerts, anything with large gatherings, 50, usually a lot of the states are 50 and higher, or some of them are 25 and higher gatherings. That's a little more reasonable to say, we're not going to have that. We're not going to put fans in the stands, that sort of thing. That helps. Encouraging a mask, but not mandating it would be
Mm-hmm.
helpful. There's the balance between your civil liberties and helping everybody else.
Right.
Um, so you don't necessarily have to mandate it. I mean, for not to get back to Florida, but here it's not mandated, and
Mm-hmm.
it really did take people a while to come around. But now I think you'd see about 80, 90% compliance with masks. No,
Okay.
it's not a mandate. So even though it's just encouraged,
Mm-hmm.
but it took a while to get there. I think if you had leadership that encouraged you to wear it instead of just kind of dismissing the whole concept,
Mm-hmm.
you could have sort of the best of both worlds, where you're not forcing it into somebody, um, but you're getting compliance because people are generally on the same page, as opposed to making this political. And the Democrats want this, and the Republicans want that, and
Right.
this is fake, or this is real, or this is over exaggerated, or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So
And what about lockdowns, for example? How do you see lockdowns in terms of is the damage that it's having on local businesses and small businesses worth it? When you see states, or even places like LA, I know, for example, still obviously aren't allowing hair salons to open up, as we're seeing with Nancy Pelosi. So,
yeah,
how?
except for Nancy can get her hair
Yeah,
done, but nobody else can.
yeah, exactly, VIP
Um,
treatment.
yeah, I mean, I understand the concept of lockdowns, but I don't think it was very well served for everybody to do it, and it really crushed small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I don't think it was the best course of action to take. I think if you had taken all those other steps, where you prevent the people from going to events more than 25 people, you do the contact tracing, the testing, and you encourage mask wearing,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you can't. That would be more beneficial. You can't let well, you apparently can in the United States, but you can dictate a lot more stuff. But you shouldn't dictate, whether a guy or a woman can open and close their business down, and then
Right.
sit there and fine them and arrest them and harass them because they're just trying to make a living and open up
Mm-hmm.
their business. So there's other things you can do. I mean, you can be stricter with restaurants and bars, but you got to allow them to open and be able to run their own companies.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, when
Yeah.
they did come through with money to help them out, it was just a complete mess. They just started throwing money at the wall. They weren't really prepared to do this. They wanted to get out on recess, so they just kind of slapped something together with PPP and said
Mm-hmm.
everybody can get it. But then it was only for rent and I think your labor or something. But
Mm-hmm.
in different cities, that's different amounts. So if you're a New York City restaurant, you're paying a lot more for your rent.
Yeah.
Uh, than other things where if you're in a smaller city, it's different. So there was no thought process as to it's different in parts of the country. And the same goes with the $600 a month extra for the unemployment compensation. So if you look at Florida, the unemployment compensation is about $275 a week outside of the $600 kicker that we had. But in Massachusetts and a lot of the states in the Northeast, it's about $600.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a huge divergence between somebody gets laid off or is unemployed in Florida, and especially a lot of the states in the South, versus someone who gets laid off in a different state might be making more than double in employment comp what you are. So there was no thought process in the federal government, and they know this. It's not that hard to figure out. And you could easily say you don't have to do 50 different plans. You could do 4 different plans and segment it so that you get $600 a month if your unemployment comp in your state is under $300, and graduate it down so you get a little bit more consistency for state to state.
So all this obviously has to be paid for. What are your views then on, in terms of taxation? Would you make any changes to the current tax system, or do you think the rich should be taxed more, taxed less? What's your opinions on just the tax structure at the minute in the USA?
Yeah, well, I mean, my basic platform is tax neutral. So I'm okay if we raise a certain tax as long as there's an offset. So for example, if you wanted to work on mobile source air pollution, you could raise the cost of a gallon of gasoline. I had suggested going up 50 cents a year for 10 years and using the revenue to lower the marginal income tax rates for individuals earning money, or earning a wage. So what that would do is eventually force people into either smaller cars or hybrids or electrics, but while giving them enough money to offset some of the losses that they might have in terms of gas at the pump. But in general, with tax policy, just to be as neutral as we can, the government doesn't really have a revenue problem. They've got a spending problem. So they don't really need to create more revenue, even if they raise taxes. And I'm sure if Biden gets in, and he's already said it, certain taxes are going higher, you're not going to get to anything remotely close to balanced budget if you raise taxes, let's say 20%. Because when he raises taxes 20%, he's not going to stop spending.
No, they'll spend more.
He's got 10 more programs that he wants the government to run. So, I mean, the best way to do it is to grow your way out without increasing spending year to year. So if you freeze spending, you let attrition take hold, you take a tax neutral approach, then you will eventually get to the balanced budget that we were talking about, and you won't adversely affect the overall economy. I'm for a smaller government, but the problem with doing that immediately is that you have significant repercussions economically if you were to take a huge chunk out of the government labor force in one fell swoop. So you can talk about, I want to close this department or that department, but there's people behind that, thousands and thousands of people. So it's easier to do it in a more gradual process, so it's not economically detrimental. And you've seen that in Europe, where they tried to do really hardcore spending cuts, whether that was Greece or some of the countries that had a little more trouble with their
Greece spending, has a real spending problem.
Austerity. So it doesn't really work because it'll push you into a recession if you go too far too fast. So you need a more gradual approach. So I think a tax neutral policy is a little more palatable, it's a little more reasonable, and it works. As opposed to, you can stand on the sideline and say, I'm for cutting the government in half, let's say, or 90% of it, but it just doesn't work in the current structure that we have. I mean, it's great to say that's my end goal in 20 years, 30 years, what have you, but it doesn't work if you had that as your platform and you were trying to get that through in your first 4 years, what have you.
In principle, do you think the wealthy are taxed fairly, or do you believe that there should be increases or decreases, or again, is that really a non-issue at the minute and just leave things the way they are and kind of makes subtler changes?
Well, you have a progressive tax rate in the country. So the wealthier do pay higher taxes if it's within their AGI, so if it's within their taxable wages at a company. The problem you have is a lot of the wealthy don't make their money through salary. They make it through capital gains and stock market or ownership in their own company. So you could find ways to make it a little more even, but it depends on where you're. I mean, you really have to raise the capital gains rate to make it more even. Cap gains rate is where the wealthy can really get ahead of the game, as opposed to the income tax that they're paying on on their wages. So
Yeah.
you have the progressive tax rate on wages, but that's not really where the disparity is coming in. But
Mm-hmm.
it's somewhat fair in that you make, I don't know where the breakdown is exactly, but if you're making under, say, $50,000, you're really not taxed very much at all, if anything, in this country. Because
Mm-hmm.
you've got,
Proportion wise, yeah.
yeah, I mean, you've got, well, I mean, the first tax bracket is, I think, 10%. I'd have to double check that, but you've got an allowance for your first, I think it's $24,000 of income where you're not paying any taxes. And then there's earned income tax credits and there's childcare credits. And there's a lot of different types of
Mm-hmm.
credits that you can go through that get you to where until you start making upper five figures that you're not really paying a significant tax rate.
Yeah. And I guess it's something I've thought about before. Capital gains tax in a lot of ways does harm the middle class that do their best to invest in certain ways and work that way. But perhaps, maybe something that could be explored as a progressive capital gains tax in some ways, where these sort of people that are making, millions and millions out of their investments can be taxed in a way that's perhaps higher than those who are, that have their retirement nest egg, perhaps that are, they're just putting that away or saving for college and things like that. I'm
Well, you
not
make a
sure.
good point with, sorry, with retirement nest eggs. Most of the middle class is in the stock market, but they're in the stock market through 401ks, which are
Mm-hmm.
deferred vehicles. So they're not paying capital gains tax rates. They'll pay tax when they get the distribution, but they're not paying any tax as the market's going up. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where the majority of the middle class is in terms of their investments. So the capital gains rate is really affecting, your upper middle to upper
Right.
class individuals.
Yeah, and I know there's probably differences in the way we do it in the UK, for example, as to how you do it. We have a similar thing to a 401k. I think ours is an ISA. It's something similar where there's I can't remember exactly how much, £20,000 free, tax free, amount or something like that. But it's probably a similar to how you guys do it. So let's talk a little bit about why you're in the race, and you've talked a bit about why you've been motivated to join, but why do you particularly think that that people should vote for you rather than the established parties, and why do you think that's a vote well spent? And I'm not trying to grill you here, but it's a
No,
question
no,
people will
fine.
ask.
Well, like I said before, I think I'm a good blend of some conservative principles. I'm fiscally conservative. I'm socially liberal, and I don't think you have that in the race. And don't think you generally have that in the race. And I think most of my platform is realistic,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to some people. They have these great ideas. I don't want to pick on Bernie Sanders for too much, but for a moment, he wants to get to a $15 minimum wage, for
Right.
example. But the minimum wage in the United States is about $7.75.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than work to get to $10 or $11 an hour, even if you don't agree with the principle in and of
Mm-hmm.
itself, what he does is he comes out with a huge number that is not going to pass. There's zero chance to get from $7.75 to $15 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but he'd rather just scream about it instead
Yep.
of trying to get something done. And the same goes for Medicare. He wants Medicare for all.
Yep.
Well, why don't you work on getting Medicare from, say, 60 years and up? If that's really, I don't agree with it, but
Yeah,
if
if
that's
that's what you
really what
want.
you want to do. So I think you have a lot of people that are on the extreme left and the extreme right that are screaming about what it is that they want, and they make very good arguments and they're honest about it a lot of times, but it's not realistic. It doesn't really make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the voice that I bring is saying, look, take a little bit of the left and a little bit of the right, and we can try to work together to get something done that's a little more reasonable. And I keep using that word, but it's you go to Washington and they get maybe one or two pieces of legislation passed a year, and they don't want to work with each other,
Mm-hmm.
and they're getting further and further apart, and it's getting more hostile by the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the country needs healed to uh,
Mm-hmm.
be brought back to the middle and come back together. And I think part of my candidacy is to try to do that and try to show that there are good people on both sides of the argument. They just grow up in different structures and
Mm-hmm.
different environments. Let's say if you take the gun issue, for example, the
Yeah.
people on the left, they want gun control, and a lot of them, like Beto O'Rourke says, yeah, we're going to take your
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
guns. He was very emotional at the time because he had just witnessed a school shooting, and not witnessed it, but he had a school shooting in his town.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's people on the far right who say, well, you can make absolutely no laws to infringe on my constitutional right to amendment. And there's people that grow up with guns, and
Right.
that's a normal part of their life. I mean, I went and visited someone, a family member, or friend of family in North Carolina, in the
Mm-hmm.
inner part of the state, and we were talking about guns, and he's got a few guns, and he'd have them in his car, and it's a normal thing for
Yeah.
him. And he asked me about mine, and I said, well, I don't have any. And you don't have any.
Yeah.
What do you do if someone comes up to your car and tries to rob you? And I'm like, in my wallet, I guess. But it's just where you grow up. So I grew up in Massachusetts.
Absolutely.
It's very densely populated. I grew up with, nobody took me out hunting or going shooting or anything like that. So it's just it wasn't for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people take that approach, or they have that background, or they live in a city and they turn on the news every night and there's a shooting every night. Whereas if you live in the middle of the country and you're not near a major city and you go hunting and you grew up that way, and a gun is just a normal part of your everyday life,
Mm-hmm.
then you're gonna fight for the Second Amendment, and you're gonna think all the other people are crazy
So it's
who want to take away your guns.
respecting the cultural differences really is what needs to happen.
Absolutely. I think you need to recognize that people are going to grow up in different environments, and that not everyone's going to view an issue the same exact way.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can, but I still think you could have some reasonable solutions and not take away people's guns, but not have completely unlimited
Mm-hmm.
access to everything. And maybe you can make some progress there. And same with pro-life and pro-choice. They won't even call themselves, or the other side, pro-life, pro-choice. They'll call them, if you're pro-lifer, you call them anti-choice, and if you're pro-choice, you call them anti-lifers.
Yeah.
The problem there is you've got legal precedent that's been in place for 47 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the pro-lifers have been trying to get Roe v. Wade overturned for that entire time. You've got a conservative Supreme Court, but they're not going to overturn
perhaps more
Roe v.
conservative.
Wade. Yeah, you could get it more conservative, but you have justices, for example, that you don't know where they stand on Roe v. Wade because they're not stupid enough to tell you. Because when you get a Supreme Court justice, they're going to be around 50 years old.
Yeah.
So these guys know Roe v. Wade's been in place since 1973. So these guys know not to be caught on record doing anything related to abortion. So they might be a conservative justice like Kavanaugh or Gorsuch or John Roberts.
Well, Gorsuch has proven himself to be a bit of a slightly swing judge.
Right. John Roberts is going a little to the left. But I think the entire strategy is flawed in that you're trying to get Roe v. Wade overturned. You're trying to get conservative justices, but you're not going to know whether they're pro-life in the first place, and whether they're hardcore pro-life enough to overturn Roe v. Wade. Even if you got that far, it just goes back to the states. So if you overturned it at the federal level, it goes to the state level.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the Republican conservative states would overturn it or ban it, and the liberal states wouldn't. So you're not really fixing the problem. The person with the unwanted pregnancy is still going to go to the state that allows it, or just do it on the side illegally. So it doesn't really solve the problem. Whereas if you took a different approach and you looked at contraceptives and education and expanding the adoption credit, maybe you'd have a lot more reduction in the number of unwanted pregnancies. I think that's what most people prefer anyway.
Yeah.
There's not much agreement between those two sides, but I think that's probably the narrow line where you could have some sort of agreement.
So then in your ideal world, then you could see your presidency then as being a mediator between the two sides and working to bring sort of this bipartisan cooperation where you can. I guess that's something we haven't seen from a president because they're by nature partisan, especially in the last, I guess, well, for pretty much forever, but for especially the last 30, 40 years, you could say they're getting more and more partisan.
It is. It's getting more and more partisan. You need a moderate, an independent, or a third party candidate to come up. I mean, the libertarian candidate is very strong. So
Mm-hmm.
if you had somebody like that or an independent as the president, so they're a little bit of each side, they can work, try to bridge the divide, bridge the gap
Mm-hmm.
between these two parties, and try to get us back to some sort of normalcy.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great it would be a great asset to the government to have a truly neutral person. See, a president, I guess, is not meant to interfere legislatively, or not meant to set the legislative agenda, particularly, especially the way the Constitution is framed. But they have an influence in legislation, and especially in cooperation. So I guess that having this neutral person in the middle would be definitely a great positive, I think, for the nation. But how do you convince the average person then to not vote for one of the main parties? How do you convince them that you're a worthwhile vote and not a wasted vote?
Well, you got to get out and talk to people like you and people out there. And, Joe Jorgensen's having the same issue on a
Mm-hmm.
larger scale, but, she's not getting included in the debates,
Yeah.
even though she's on the ballot in all 50 states. So, and part of it is
Mm-hmm.
ballot access. So trying to get on the ballots in as many states as you can, or write-in access to where you have a fighting chance. But the media is basically holding the duopoly in place. So they're purposely not entertaining a third party, a fourth party,
Right.
or more. And some of them, you know, some of them have some outlandish ideas if you go past, the fourth party or so. But
Right.
that's fine if you're on the ballot.
People can
And
make the decision.
people should make the decision. You should give, Jorgensen and Hawkins, the Green Party candidate, equal
Mm-hmm.
time, or at least something even remotely close to equal time on the networks. And then I think you'd have much more of a fair fight.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you let them in the debates, I mean, the debate is run by the debate commission, made up of Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
And you've got to get to 15% of the popular vote in a handful of polls leading into the debates. But the people that run the polls don't usually ask
Yep.
to
Offer the
vote for
option. Yeah.
the third or fourth option. So,
Yeah.
how
Oh,
do you get there? I
it's
mean,
totally a rigged system in that regard. Absolutely.
correct. So, I mean, you've got to end the duopoly, at least to some extent. I mean, if a third party candidate can get to 5% of the vote, they can get federally funded. So that would be one step in the right
Mm-hmm.
direction. So there's little things you can do to kind of move the needle along. Um, but it's hard. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
two-party control and it's a rigged system.
Yep.
But we'll
And
do what we can to try to get your message out and the
it's
voice out.
interesting. It's interesting with people like Joe Rogan that are doing. I know you tweeted about his offer to President Trump, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about your views on the two candidates that your main opposition. But people who are, I guess, powerful voices in independent media, it's interesting to see how they are increasingly influential, and they're bringing people who maybe didn't have a platform. They're bringing them the publicity that people can see and what they're like and what they stand for. And it's interesting because you see there's quite a large movement to nominate Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw as candidates as a ticket. So you see these people that are they're not even running for president, just by being exposed to the masses. People are starting to say, well, I kind of want this person as president, even though they're not standing. I want them. And do you think then that this independent, I guess the freedom of the internet is going to have an increasingly important part to play in deciding elections in the future?
I would hope so. I mean, with Joe Rogan, as you brought him up, Andrew Yang went on his podcast about a year ago,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what really got his candidacy to take off.
Yeah.
And Yang is, he's liberal, obviously he's a Democrat, but he's as far removed, I suppose, as you could. He wasn't a political operative before that, wasn't holding office, so that's as close to an independent, I suppose, as you could get at that time. But Rogan brought him on his podcast. He had 11 million followers on his show, so that really propelled Yang at least into the debate stage. So, and what you do from there is up to you. So I think, but I mean, then you go back to the media when Yang would get on the debate stage and he'd get two questions
Yeah, exactly.
at or whatever. So it's an uphill battle. I mean, he got part of the way there,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a struggle to get, like I was saying earlier, equal time. Um, so it's
Mm-hmm.
does the all the podcasts and the internet and everything that goes on with Twitter and Facebook and all the social media, does it help? Probably helps to some extent, but we're still, it's still party control.
Yeah.
It's a long way away from a Tulsi Gabbard or somebody else rising up. And
Mm-hmm.
she's got a great following, but she's persona non grata with the Democratic Party,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is interesting. She's the only woman of color to receive delegates
Yep.
Democratic National Convention, and they wouldn't let her speak
Exactly. I thought it was pretty disgraceful, to be honest. And Tulsi, I think, is
because they don't like her.
well,
But
she's a compelling candidate to me. Not only, yes, she does tick the diversity and representation boxes in terms of being female and being a woman of color, and that to me is not as big a deal. But it's more her ability to seem like she's responsible, she's intelligent, and she's someone of a military background, but also someone who has seen the horrors of war. And you see then people start to then respect that she is going against her own party and obviously thinking very freely. And I think people respect that in a lot of ways, that she's not just a stooge from the Democratic Party, and she is intelligent. And it's the same with Dan Crenshaw in some ways. He's more on the party line, but also doesn't seem quite like the standard Republican,
right, I mean,
personality.
you've got to be able to speak out against party establishment, and but there's punishment for it. Tulsi didn't support Hillary Clinton in 2016, and
Yeah.
that's where they
Curtains.
started.
Yeah.
Yeah, they started moving against her, and you're right. She speaks freely. She's intelligent. She's got the military background, so when she says she wants non-intervention, that she's got a lot more credibility than say a non-military person who would say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So she's been over, I think, in Iraq or in that theater, I believe. So she has a lot more credibility to
Yeah.
say, we shouldn't be there or we shouldn't be in
Mm-hmm.
this location or that location. Um, but you can only push back against the party so much, or you're on the sidelines.
Mm-hmm.
With Crenshaw, I think he's a little more party line.
Yeah.
He's a rising star, so you might see him probably in 2024 running or
Yeah.
or
Somewhere in the
28
future.
or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in the future, depending on how this plays out with Trump and Biden and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to being commander in chief, how do you feel about that? How would you feel about being given this responsibility of being the commander in chief? And is that a daunting thing for you?
You would think it was daunting, but you've just got to be responsible and not start wars and conflicts that you don't necessarily need to be in. I mean, I've seen where there's extreme positions where you say, okay, you can be Switzerland and just armed and
Mm-hmm.
peaceful, but you got to be realistic too. There's a lot of bad people in the world, and Russia is going to run roughshod all over um, Eastern Europe and elsewhere if you just give them a free pass to do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise with China within Southeast Asia. So, that doesn't mean go and start wars in Iraq and Syria and everywhere else that, the U.S. tends to stick their nose into, the U.S. government does.
Yeah.
So I think I'm more of a non-intervention
Okay.
person. So I'm not interested in having U.S. troops in 150 countries or whatever number we're at the current
Mm-hmm.
moment. There's only 197 countries in the first place. So we seem to have people everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that can clearly be dialed back, and you just don't have to go into every conflict that comes up. But at the same time, you don't want to ignore potential issues. You need to protect your allies. You need to be in NATO. There's countries in NATO that depend on us,
Mm-hmm.
that would disappear if we just completely abandon them. So, I mean, Trump is right that they need to pay their fair share. They need to
Yeah.
spend their 2% of GDP. So when he says stuff like that, these other countries might get ticked off. But he's right. If you want us to protect you, and we should, then at least come to the table and pay the fair share, even though we may not need it in that particular sense. But
Mm-hmm.
um, so you've got to be more, you got to be responsible as a commander in chief. And,
Yeah.
we see that to some extent with prior presidents, um, but not always the case. I mean,
Yeah, in some ways, the ones that are less conspicuous are the ones that have done the most harm in the background that you may not have even realized. So, I'm thinking of I'm not calling out Obama on this, but he was definitely someone. He was more interventionist than Trump would have been, but at the same time, people think Trump's the warmonger and Obama was the peacemaker. So this is the
yeah,
interesting
that's not.
dynamic. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
think I saw a statistic. I don't know if it's accurate that Trump broke I think it's like a 40-year-old or 39-year-old record of the U.S. intervening or starting a war or adding to the hostilities in a country. So Trump,
wow.
to his credit, hasn't really started anything,
Mm-hmm.
to my knowledge. I mean, he did get caught in the first month. He put troops down in, I think it was Yemen, and it didn't go very well.
Yeah.
But that was more of an insertion than anything else. But for the most part, he stayed out of large military conflict.
Mm-hmm. And
As much as he opens his mouth and says stupid things, you gotta give credit for that.
well, I was just about to say, what are your opinions then on your opponents? So we'll start with the current document, and then maybe talk a little bit about his primary challenger after that. So, what are your opinions on the current president?
Well, if he doesn't open his mouth, I think he's not that terrible on
Yeah,
policy.
this is a lot of people's
Supports,
point of view, I
yeah, I mean,
think.
like I was saying, he's non-intervention in military. He generally supports economic growth, tax cuts. Um, but then he opens his mouth and he wants to be a dictator and he wants to run for 12 more years and he wants, um, you know, he basically advocates aggression and violence. You can go run the tape for the last few years, but there's always something where he's saying, put the perpetrator and make sure you hit his head on the way into the police car.
Mm-hmm.
Just little things here and there, and it just adds up and adds up. And
Yeah.
he basically advocates violence. He ignores the white supremacists. Says, there's bad people on both sides, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
Where
Well, the bad people on both sides thing I think is definitely interesting because it's definitely has been mischaracterized in some ways. Um, but again, he kind of skirts the line of being true and but not being helpful as well. So yes, there's bad people on both sides, and but is that a helpful statement to make in that particular moment? Who knows? So
no,
this is an
and
interesting thing, an
no, and
interesting.
in general, he doesn't want to bring the country together. It's
Yeah.
divide and conquer. So I mean, that's not really what we need. Even though I might agree with him on fiscal policy or non-intervention in foreign conflicts, but it's response to coronavirus was just terrible. I mean, it's just one thing after another with him, and
Mm-hmm.
the authoritarian mindset where you ignore your allies and warm up to Putin and some of the other leaders of the world, part in the Philippines and North Korea, all these things. It's just not helpful. I mean, to his credit, he tried to hold China accountable on trade, but it would have been
Mm-hmm.
a lot better if he had some of his European allies at the same time to come down on China and to do more of a combined effort. But instead, it's the United States standing alone, which China can
Mm-hmm.
handle. If the U.S. slaps tariffs on, or if the U.S. wants to decouple from China, they can actually handle that. But if you actually didn't aggravate your allies and you try to work with them, like Germany, like the UK and
Yeah,
France,
a more
then
of a
you went to
coalition.
China and said, look, you guys are not playing fair. We want free trade, but it has to be fair trade, which China doesn't do. Then he would have got a lot further along. So the trade agreement he got didn't really move the needle very
Mm-hmm.
much. But you give him credit for trying, and because the two presidents before that have not really held China to account on anything. They've militarized the South China Sea with 7 different islands that
Mm-hmm.
they put weaponry on, and we just basically let them.
Yeah, man-made islands. Yeah.
Right. I mean, now he's letting Putin do that on the other direction, but not so much islands, but in terms of militarily, he just ignores
Mm-hmm.
whatever Russia does. So he's not consistent in that regard, but um, it's more, it's more that he just doesn't believe in democracy. I don't think.
That's an interesting statement. Do you want to expand a little on that?
He prefers dictatorships. He prefers the authoritarian line of government. Um, thinks, and he's made multiple comments about that over the years.
In a personal regard, or in terms of actually wanting to shift the U.S. towards an actual dictatorship? Do you believe?
I think he wants both. Yeah, he would love to have a Trump in office for the next 50 years and just hand it down to his kids um, and his grandkids and so on and so forth. And he's already joked about having the presidency for 12 more years. 4 years ago, he joked about let's just cancel the election. Who really needs it? Or
Yeah,
this
but do you
time
believe
around.
this? Do you believe this is all just trash talk, or do you really
No,
think this is
this is who he is. I mean,
okay?
if it's a comment here and there, it's one thing, but he's been talking this way for years, and this is how you get there, because most dictatorships start with some level of democracy, and it's just the guy doesn't lead, um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how. Look at Russia. I mean, Putin got elected. I believe he got elected normally, and then he just kind of worked around the edges, and he went from I think
Yeah,
president to prime
the prime minister.
minister
Yeah,
and
back and forth. Yeah.
back and forth. So you know and there's a lot of cases of like that it starts off as an elected process and then somebody gets in there and just disappears.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
it's Trump is, I guess, supremely unpopular. Not necessarily. His fan base is larger than you would think. But do you think that he could, if he had the chance, do you think he would find a way to stay in power despite the odds of, I guess, a lot of the media being against him and a lot of mainstream culture being against him?
well, the odds would be against him. He'd have to change the can't remember which amendment it is. 25th amendment 20,
Yeah, 24th or 25th, something like that. Yeah.
yeah, that allows for a third term, but that's how you would probably do it to start. You'd just be like, oh, what's wrong with 3 terms? FDR had 4 terms, and this was the case for the United States for the first whatever it is, 170 years of
Mm-hmm.
existence in the United States. There was no 2 term limit. So let's just go back to the way we were. I'm sure he could make that argument and he'd have at least his supporters 100% on his side.
Yeah.
But in order to change the amendment to the Constitution, you're going to need 2/3 majority. And that's where he'd
Yeah,
have
it's a
a lot
really
more trouble.
really tricky process. I couldn't see him actually doing it is the thing. I think he may be more talk than actually. He may secretly wish, he may think that wouldn't be so bad, but I don't know if he's necessarily a menace in that regard that he would actually attempt something like that. Is that your opinion that he could perhaps in the right circumstances go for I guess a coup like that?
Well, I hope you're right that he wouldn't, but
Not to be trusted then is the key.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I hope you're right, but history shows us in all these other countries that
Mm,
that's not the case. The
mm-hmm.
people in power want to stay in power. Um,
Yeah.
actually, at the end of George Bush's presidency, I think he said something to the effect of this is very addictive of being in power,
Yeah.
especially in the second term. And you see in anybody's second term that there's a little bit more corruption, a little bit more arrogance, complacency, and you start going down that path. So the longer you're in
Mm.
power, the longer it's going to corrupt
Yeah,
you.
you
And
become more of an imperial figure really as the present as the your time goes on.
correct. And then
Yeah.
you're not running for anything
Yeah,
after you
nothing to
pass the
lose.
second term. So then you're no holds
So
barred.
just to touch on a little bit, you mentioned about it being, I guess, a negative that he worked with Kim Jong Un. Is that something you as president would have worked towards, or do you believe that that's a bad precedent to set? Trying to work with the dictators of the world.
I think it's okay to work with the dictators of the world, but to give Kim Jong Un a photo op and go there or to have to meet over, and I think they were meeting in South Korea or whatever it was.
On the border, yeah.
Um, yeah, at the border, DMZ. It's not a good look for the president or any American president, and nothing's really going to get accomplished. He's still going to build nuclear weapons on the side. There's there's really nothing to gain from the U.S. perspective. There's everything to gain from the North Korean perspective. You're raising the level of your leader. He's meeting with the American president, negotiating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there, I just don't see anything to be gained on our side from doing that. It's good to talk to them, and his people should talk to their people and try to come up with some sort of agreement in terms of what's aggravating them, like the military exercises at the border really upsets the North Koreans. The nuclear weapons obviously upsets us. So maybe you could come up to some type of agreement at the margins. But we haven't seen that. He's met him 2 or 3 times, I think, or changed correspondence, and
times, yeah.
Nothing's really come of it.
So let's then talk about a little bit about Joe Biden, and I'm particularly interested in your views on, I guess, the whole Black Lives Matter stroke riots stroke all civil unrest slant on things, and whether he perhaps is promoting that sort of behavior in society.
I don't know if he's promoting it so much as he was ignoring it. He's not in control, so you got to give him that he's a contender. He's not in charge of anything at the moment. But there's a big difference between silent protesting and all the looting and rioting that's going on, and the Black Lives Matter as a statement is fine, and it's important to make that statement, because
absolutely,
you can say all lives matter, but that kind of misses the point of what they're trying to accomplish, which is that Black lives have not been held equally over the years in the United States. That's why the movement, or that's why the statement exists, movement exists. I think where the problem is the organization, or the, I don't know, call it an organization, loosely held organization, where they're
it's a movement, really, I guess you could say.
Yeah, where people are accosting diners and outdoor restaurants, and it's already happened in, I think, Washington D.C., and it's happened in Pittsburgh, and in I think Rochester, New York, and basically in cities all over the country, where at least under the banner of BLM, they're really hostile and screaming at random people to support them, and whatever it is that we want, that's what you have to support. It's really a disservice to the Black Lives Matter statement.
Yeah.
It really just helps Donald Trump, and he starts talking about law and order, and you see these videos of an old couple getting accosted and just out eating dinner.
Doesn't help at all, does it?
It doesn't help. So I think Biden saw his poll numbers go down, and he finally made a statement that rioting and looting is bad. He let it fester for a good part of a month, and they're not necessarily his supporters. People rioting or looting probably aren't all that political, I would imagine.
Hard to say. Where they stand on that spectrum.
But if he wants to be the leader of the country, you've got to come out and be a little more forceful. He's got the platform; he could talk to any media outlet he wants, at any time. So he really probably should have quelled that a lot faster. But to his credit, he did it. I don't know, about a week or two ago. But he's got to keep that up. You got to get better control over your cities. Whatever part you play in that is beneficial.
So why would you be better for America than Joe Biden as president?
Well, Joe's been in Washington for almost 50 years. I'm doing this interview, not to pick on him, but I'm doing this interview without a teleprompter.
That's true. Yeah.
And it makes me really nervous that he needs one. This is someone who should be very seasoned in doing any type of interview ever. He's been interviewing and talking to media for 50 years, since he was running for the Senate when he was 29 years old. And it's a bad sign. It's a very bad sign, and it plays right into what Trump is talking about with the senility and mental acumen and things like that. And whether that's true or not, I have no idea. I'm not a doctor, but it's a bad sign when you're telling your people to keep scrolling, things like that. So I don't know. I'm not very confident in his ability to run the country for the next 4 years.
Well, a 4 hour long podcast with Joe Rogan would be an absolute catastrophe with him. I thoroughly believe that. I mean,
Yes.
yes, you have opinions I saw on Twitter as well on that whole, whether who it would benefit and what Trump's motivations are for supporting that. But I think we can all
But yeah,
agree that. Oh,
my
sorry, go
only
ahead.
point is politicians in general, any race you're running, the guy who's losing or the candidate who's losing wants more debates because it's the only way you can get back in the game. And the only way
You believe
the
Trump's
person,
losing then in the race?
well, yeah, I mean, he's definitely losing. He's down by 7.5% nationally. He's down in almost every battleground state. So by the numbers, he's clearly behind. So the person who's behind always wants more debates. The person in the lead always wants to hide or make the most limited amount of media appearances they can so they don't make
risk
mistakes.
management. Yeah.
And Hillary did the same thing, and she did it a little bit too much because she was ahead by 7% after, especially after Trump's Access Hollywood tape.
And
she made herself very limited in terms of what types of programs she was going on, and Trump was out there everywhere. And then towards the very end, it narrowed, and obviously she lost. But in hindsight, she could have gone to Wisconsin. She never went to the state, and she lost 10 electoral votes there. So,
and a very similar situation happened in the UK where, a couple of years ago, Theresa May as Prime Minister called another election, and again, very limited. She made the campaign about her. She was, the whole campaign was "I'm with Theresa May, back Theresa," and then they made the campaign about her, but she didn't have that many appearances. She didn't even turn up for the debates. She sent a replacement in, and I think this idea of risk management, sometimes it doesn't work out in that way because your opponent's just gobbling up all the free airtime, and you're the one that's sitting, not capitalizing on and making hay while the sun shines, and I guess this could be a real problem for Biden, especially if it becomes more and more apparent that he's, well, I don't want to say lost his marbles, but people are assuming that.
He's what's the nicest way to say it? That he's lost a step or something like that?
I feel bad for saying this, but I said to people, I think he's at the stage in life where he needs to have a lake house and feed the ducks and relax with his grandkids, and it should be where he's at in life. And some people say to me, no, that's a mercy he doesn't deserve. He's a Washington, corrupt, whatever. I just think he's done well, and that he wasn't. I don't think this was his battle to fight, personally.
Yeah, I mean, he's a likable guy. I mean, if you look at his backstory and you've watched him over the years, I mean, you like him. Even Republicans, at least coming into this, were like, yeah, we like Uncle Joe, and he's a good guy, and he's harmless. He says a couple of stupid things with his gaffes, put him out. But generally, they didn't really have too much of a problem with him. He worked with the other side of the aisle, had friends in McCain and some other guys on the right. I just don't think he's up for it straight years.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that.
I mean, I hate to say it that way. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. But
on current evidence.
On current evidence, it's not looking good. I mean, and the funny thing is, we run the primaries here in Iowa and New Hampshire to start off, and they're like 98% white, and there's pushback about whether that's reflective of the overall Democratic process and whatnot. But those folks get an up-close view of all the candidates for an extended period of time.
Yep.
And they thought Biden was, I think, 4th and 5th place for someone who had all the money, all the name recognition.
He was found lacking by the voters.
Yeah, and he wasn't handling himself very well in town halls, that's probably one of the harder things you run as a campaign. Yeah. To stand in front of a group of people and just take whatever question they want to fire at you. But he's challenging people with push-ups, and he's talking.
Come on, man! That seems to be the most common response. So
the responses just make you scratch your head a little bit, and he took a big showed in Iowa, New Hampshire. He came around in South Carolina, and then everybody else ran out of money, and so on and so forth. But I don't think he's the strongest candidate of the 100 million people that are Democrats, or 100 million people that are Democrats in this country. That's if you really think that Trump is the most evil person in the world, and they do if you listen to CNN or MSNBC or any of those guys, then I don't understand why Joe Biden is your candidate.
Yeah, if you at least pick someone, even though I don't think Bernie would have a chance of winning, but at least it would be a fair fight where someone is really pushing them the whole way. And you need that's what was missing, I think, and that's my. I wouldn't. I don't know if I would consider myself a Democrat if I wasn't American, but I think democracy is, um, it's not good for democracy that he doesn't have a strong candidate pushing him the whole way, as in someone to challenge Trump on everything he says, and
Right.
someone that's engaging and able to really challenge him.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the field was stronger.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party had some good candidates in there um, that were stronger. I mean, they all had certain things where you'd like, well, okay, Buttigieg's kind of young and he was a mayor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Klobuchar was a strong candidate. Tulsi was a strong candidate, even though she didn't, got whatever it was, one, two, three
Well, they made
percent.
her out to be some kind of war criminal or something. So
Right. Yeah. So, they had solid candidates, and if the establishment got behind them, I think they'd be in a much better position right now than. I mean, they're
mm-hmm.
winning, so you can't, or at least on the if you look at the polls, but I think they'd be much stronger going into debates,
Mm-hmm.
and for the final 50 days here.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly touch as well on a comment on your website about the border security facilities being concentration camps in effect. Um,
Uh,
so
I wrote that about a while ago, but yeah, yeah.
yeah, would you still stand by that statement then that that's effectively what they represent?
Yeah, I mean, you don't. I mean, if you look at the way they're set up, they're cages, and it's just not very humane the way it's set up. I mean, I understand that you need you need border security, and you need to have a facility to handle the number of people that come over,
Mm-hmm.
where you process them to send them back or to send them into the court system or whatever it is you're going to do with them. Um, but to sit there and put dozens of people in one little area or one little
Yeah.
cage um, is just reprehensible from the wealthiest country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that difficult to set some money aside and build a massive facility um,
Yes.
at, at a handful of locations near the border, and put people there and build a facility that's 10 times bigger.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you in this regard
It's not like
because
there's no money because
yeah,
they
well, you see a lot of people. I remember seeing the acting director of ICE before Congress saying, "Well, he just said you won't give us the money, so what do you expect us to do?" And this was he made a good point in that regard. And I want to the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about this is, my wife having gone through the UK immigration process. It's not an easy process, and it's not an expensive process. It's something that I don't believe people should just be able to get around. And I do agree with you that there should be better facilities on the border. Particularly, I think money should be made available to house people humanely. At the same time, I think people do need to go through the correct procedures and processes. And I was wondering, do you agree then that this is what needs to happen more, or would you be for more loose border restrictions, and which would be fair enough,
No, I mean, I'm for border security, but I think you can't solve the immigration problem until you solve the border problem. So if they're not going to put the money and the personnel and the facilities at the border, the southern border,
Mm-hmm.
to control the flow of people coming over, then it's not even worth arguing whether on the immigration status and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So and there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress. I mean, Trump talked about building the wall and
Yeah, I was gonna ask, what about the wall?
all this stuff. I think he's built like, I don't know, 10 miles um, since he's become president, and a lot. I think he's replaced some fencing or
Mm-hmm.
wall or whatever you want to call it that was already there. I mean, we've got, I believe, 700 miles of fencing on a 2,200-mile border.
Mm-hmm.
So, not that you need fencing for the whole thing, but you need some sort of electric version or electronic version
Mm-hmm.
there. You can
Yeah,
monitor people coming
monitoring. Yeah.
across. You're not going to be able to build a fence or a wall in the middle of the Rio Grande. You're going to screw up habitat for a number of species.
Mm-hmm.
But you can put facilities in there and monitor it without, a physical fence. Um, until you control the flow of immigrants across the border, then all the rest is just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And if I guess if you don't, you still have to build the facilities, like I was saying, or you're going to end up with what you have
Yeah,
now.
and
Um,
the question would naturally would be, should the facilities exist? Is it humane to house people there at all? Should you just basically turn them away and say, on your way, go back where you came from? Is this the way you should do it, or should you bring people in and house them and process them in that regard? Or I mean, there's a lot of
you've
questions in that regard.
yeah, you've got to have better facilities if you're gonna bother to capture them and hold them for
Yeah.
however amount of time you want to hold them, a week, a month, what have you. Uh, don't even bother holding them if you're not going to put them in something that's humane.
Mm-hmm.
Just catch and release, I think, is what Obama did, and put them right back. Although I believe he built the facilities under his administration, um, so it didn't get a lot of press at the time until Trump became president.
Yeah, exactly. And then it
So
was open season.
yeah, so you've got to build the facilities, and when you get to the point where you don't need them anymore, then that's a good problem to have. Then you
Mm-hmm.
donate it to a hospital or a school or
Yep. Yeah.
something, or you tear them down and you don't need them anymore. But right now we need them, and you can't put
Mm.
whatever the number is, 5,000 people in a facility that's built for 500.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't make any sense, and especially being the richest country in the world, it's
Yeah.
just sad.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, but immigration's a problem. You can't just have borders and let everybody come across. I mean, that doesn't make any sense either.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
it doesn't seem to be handled very
yeah,
well.
yeah. There's definitely. I think we can all agree. There's better ways to deal with the problems. It's been great talking to you and getting to know a bit about who you are and what you're standing for. The final question is, what would success look like for you in this campaign, other than becoming obviously president of the United States? What are the issues you're seeking to bring to the table? What would you see as a successful campaign, even if you don't succeed in winning
I
the
think
presidency?
success for me is, I mean, I'm write-in eligible in 25 states. So success for me is more to get the message out that
Mm-hmm.
there are more moderate voices out there in the country, and people that want fair, insane solutions to the problems that are in front of us. And so success would just be if people come together just a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
stop being as insanely divisive as they are now. From a numbers point of view, I mean, it doesn't matter too much, as long as I can kind of get the message out there
Mm-hmm.
and go from there.
And it's important to give people who want to vote for a moderate voice. I think it's important to give them a way to exercise their kind of democratic their voice in the process. And people talk about spoiling their ballots or not voting or anything like that. And I think being able to physically vote for someone who stands for what you believe in, I think that's a great way for people to engage. It's better than just not voting, because at least you get to put your say kind of on record. And I think it's good that people have someone to vote for in yourself that is moderate, and if that lines up with their points of view. So I
Yeah,
think
thank you. And there was, I think, 50 million people didn't vote in the last election. So if you can give the voters more choices, and whether that's moderate or some other variation, then hopefully you get more people out there that will exercise their right to vote.
And do you want to tell everyone listening a little bit about where they can find more about you, or where you're on social media or on the internet, where they can learn more?
Yeah, my campaign website is ShawnHoward2020.com. It's SHAWN. And my Twitter handle is the same, and Facebook, and pretty much every social media handle is the same. But
Yeah.
I run most things through Twitter, and it's Shawn Howard 2020, or at Shawn Howard 2020.
And what are some of
So
the main states that you're on the ballot for, and how can people vote in other states?
well, I'm writing in Florida. There's only 8 writing candidates there. Also in Georgia and Illinois, so a couple of the medium-sized,
Mm-hmm.
big-sized states where there's a very limited amount of candidates on the either write-in or on the actual ballot. And I should be up in New York as write-in eligible as soon as they confirm it for me.
Okay.
So there's only some states won't even count you as a write-in candidate. There's 8 or 9 of them that just say
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter, we're not going to count you. So
Yeah.
there's only about 41 there or so that are eligible. So I should be on in 25 right now, and I'm waiting to hear on a couple more.
And all the details are on your website, obviously, of where people can
Yes,
vote for you. Yeah.
there's a tab for ballot access. There's a tab for media appearances I've done, um, as well as where I stand on a variety of issues like you
Mm.
were talking about with immigration. So
Awesome.
I believe I have about 50 issues
Mm-hmm.
take out there, blurbs on where I stand on a particular issue.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me, and it was great to get to talk to you. And yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there for this week. So thanks everyone for listening to this week's episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About podcast. And if you enjoy this podcast, make sure you like it, subscribe, and leave any comments you have for Shawn down below. I'm sure he'll get to see some of them and perhaps even respond. And you can contact him obviously directly on social media. But thanks for watching, everyone, and hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next week.